Every time you merge onto an interstate, you're driving on infrastructure built to survive the end of civilization. The exits, the minimum curve radii, the straight stretches that appear every few miles with no apparent purpose, none of that is accidental. You've been driving on a military evacuation network your entire life, and almost nobody ever told you. This is the story of how the United States built 48,000 miles of highway, not primarily to move commerce, not to connect cities, not even to ease the post-war automobile boom, but to evacuate 150 million Americans from atomic fireballs and move armored divisions across the continent before Soviet missiles could finish the job the bombs started. June 29th, 1956, Washington, D.C. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signs the Federal Aid Highway Act into law. The bill authorizes $25 billion, the largest public works expenditure in American history at that point, to construct a national system of interstate and defense highways. The press covers it as a transportation story. Roads, jobs, progress. They missed the word in the middle: defense. Eisenhower knew something the reporters didn't emphasize, or chose not to. He had seen what highways meant to a military power. In 1919, as a young Army lieutenant colonel, he joined the U.S. Army's Transcontinental Motor Convoy, a military exercise that drove a convoy of 81 vehicles from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco to test whether the Army could move men and materiel across the country in an emergency. The journey took 62 days. Bridges collapsed under the weight of trucks, roads dissolved into mud, vehicles broke axles on rutted tracks that barely qualified as paths. The convoy averaged 5 miles per hour across Nebraska. The United States Army, Eisenhower concluded, could not defend its own territory if it couldn't move across it. 25 years later, commanding the Allied forces in Europe, Eisenhower saw the other side of the equation. Germany's Autobahn, Hitler's highway system, begun in 1933, allowed the Wehrmacht to shift entire armored divisions laterally across the front in hours. When Allied bombing destroyed rail lines, German trucks used the Autobahn as a military logistics spine. The highways didn't win Germany the war, but they dramatically extended how long Germany could resist losing it. Eisenhower filed both lessons away. In 1956, with Soviet bombers capable of reaching American cities and the hydrogen bomb capable of leveling them, he pulled those lessons out. The Soviet threat and the calculus of survival. To understand why the highway system was designed the way it was, you have to understand what American military planners believed they were facing in 1955. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, 4 years ahead of American projections. By 1953, they had tested a hydrogen bomb. By 1955, they had long-range bombers, the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, capable of reaching American cities on one-way missions. The CIA estimated that in an all-out Soviet first strike, hundreds of American cities could be targeted within hours. The casualty projections were beyond anything modern people are comfortable thinking about. Tens of millions dead in the first wave. Tens of millions more in the following weeks from radiation, fire, and the collapse of food distribution networks. Civil defense planners ran the numbers obsessively. If a Soviet bomber dropped a 10-megaton weapon on Detroit, the fireball would be 2 miles wide. The overpressure wave would collapse reinforced concrete buildings 4 miles from the detonation point. Thermal radiation would ignite fires at distances of 15 miles. In a city of 2 million people with no evacuation infrastructure, the fatalities from a single weapon could approach 1,000,000. The solution, according to Federal Civil Defense Administration Director Val Peterson and a generation of Cold War planners, was dispersal. You could not harden American cities against atomic weapons. The weapons were too powerful. But you could, in theory, empty the cities fast enough, if you had the roads. Here was the strategic problem. In 1955, American cities did not have roads capable of emptying them. The highway networks around major metropolitan areas were designed for normal traffic flows. When 50,000 people tried to leave a city simultaneously, as they did during hurricane evacuations or during World War II coastal blackout drills, the road system seized. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Cars ran out of fuel sitting still. The evacuation plans existed on paper. The infrastructure to execute them did not. The Federal Aid Highway Act was, in significant part, the answer to that problem. The engineering of survival. The design standards written into the Interstate Highway System were not chosen for comfort or cost efficiency. They were chosen to meet military specifications. The minimum lane width on interstate highways is 12 feet, wider than any other American road standard. The reasoning was explicit in internal planning documents. Army vehicles, including tracked carriers and supply trucks, required 12-foot lanes to operate at speed without maneuvering room becoming a bottleneck. The wider lanes weren't for passenger cars. They were for M48 Patton tanks and 6x6 Army trucks moving toward mobilization points. The maximum grade on interstate highways is 6%, 1 foot of rise for every 17 feet of horizontal distance. This wasn't driven by fuel economy or driver comfort. Military logistics vehicles of the 1950s, fully loaded, could not maintain speed on steeper grades. A convoy that bogs down on a hill becomes a target. Every overpass on the interstate system was built to the same specification, capable of bearing military loads, including the tracked vehicles that would destroy lighter civilian bridge structures. The minimum curve radius, how gently a highway must turn before it's considered an acceptable curve, was set high enough that transport aircraft could use straight interstate sections as emergency runways. This is perhaps the most famous piece of Cold War highway lore, and it is, in its broad outlines, true. Planning documents from the Bureau of Public Roads in the 1950s explicitly reference the possibility of using interstate sections for aircraft operations. The 1 mile in 5 straight sections that appear throughout the system were not accidents of terrain or cost savings. They were built into the design standard intentionally. Overpasses were built to minimum clearance heights of 14 feet, enough for Army vehicles, including truck-mounted anti-aircraft systems, to pass beneath without restriction. The clearance wasn't set for double-decker buses or recreational vehicles. It was set for the profile of military equipment that American defense planners needed to move in an emergency. The access control design, the fact that interstates have no traffic lights, no at-grade crossings, no driveways connecting directly to the roadway, was partly about traffic flow efficiency, but it was also explicitly about preventing the system from being blocked. A single stalled vehicle at a traffic light can stop an entire urban artery. An interstate, by design, could route around obstacles. The entrance and exit ramps meant that even a disabled vehicle or a bombed section wouldn't completely halt movement. Traffic could divert, continue, route around the problem. These weren't features added to an existing civilian design. They were the design. The man who sold the country its own defense network. The political story of the Interstate Highway System runs through Clay, Lucius Clay, who had been Eisenhower's chief logistics officer in Europe and was one of the most capable military administrators the Army had ever produced. In 1954, Eisenhower asked Clay to chair a presidential advisory committee on a national highway program. Clay's committee produced a report in January 1955 that became the blueprint for the Federal Aid Highway Act. The Clay report was careful about how it framed the highway program publicly. It emphasized commerce, reduced accidents, economic development, and the connection of American cities. The defense rationale appeared, but it was not the headline. This was deliberate. The American public of 1955 was not enthusiastic about explicit reminders of nuclear vulnerability. Civil defense programs, with their duck and cover drills and backyard fallout shelters, were already provoking a mix of grim preparedness and dark humor. Presenting a $25 billion highway bill as primarily a nuclear survival program would have provoked uncomfortable questions. It might have failed in Congress. The interstate system was sold as prosperity infrastructure that happened to serve defense purposes, rather than defense infrastructure that happened to serve civilian needs. The framing was not dishonest, exactly. The highways did serve enormous civilian purposes. The economic case for an interconnected highway system was entirely real. But the design requirements, the lane widths, the load ratings, the clearances, the access controls, those came from military specifications, not traffic studies. Within the Bureau of Public Roads, the defense rationale was openly discussed. In classified planning documents from 1955 and 1956, the highway system's role in nuclear evacuation, military mobilization, and civil defense was described explicitly. The system was officially designated the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. The word defense was in the name. Most Americans just never asked what it meant. What the system was built to do in an emergency. War Plan C, one of several civil defense scenarios developed in the early 1950s, called for the evacuation of major metropolitan areas within 30 minutes of a nuclear attack warning. The warning time, assuming Soviet bombers flying over the Arctic, was estimated at between 3 and 6 hours. Ballistic missiles, which would reduce that window to minutes, were not yet in the Soviet arsenal when the highways were being designed. Planners were working with the bomber threat. 30-minute evacuation meant mass movement. In New York City, planners estimated that 2 million vehicles would need to move simultaneously on designated evacuation routes within the first hour of an alert. The highways surrounding the city were designed with those flow rates in mind. The connecting interstates were meant to funnel those vehicles into dispersal zones 60 to 100 miles from the city center, outside the immediate lethal radius of the largest weapons the Soviets were expected to deploy. The dispersal zone concept was not just about survival, it was about preserving the workforce. American industrial capacity in the 1950s was heavily concentrated in a small number of metropolitan areas. Detroit made cars and tanks. Pittsburgh made steel. Akron made rubber. If those cities were destroyed and their workers killed, the American war production capacity that had won World War II would be gone. The highways weren't just evacuation routes for civilians. They were the mechanism for preserving the human industrial base that a prolonged conflict would require. Military planners had a parallel need. If the Soviet Union struck American airfields and bases first, surviving army units would need to move to secondary positions and regroup. The interstate system provided the road network for that redeployment. The connection between major military installations, Fort Bragg to the coast, bases in the south to ports in the north, logistics hubs to mobilization centers, was explicitly mapped onto the highway routing decisions. Cities that happened to be on militarily important corridors got interstates. Some cities that seemed natural highway candidates did not, because their corridors didn't align with the military movement requirements. The gaps that were never accidents. Here is something almost nobody in the general public knows about the interstate highway system. The gaps were intentional. Several American cities were deliberately not connected to the interstate system in ways that traffic logic would have suggested. The routing decisions that seem to modern drivers like historical oversights or political failures were often the result of explicit choices. Some corridors were routed to avoid terrain where Soviet targeting planners would have expected American military convoys to move. Some cities were connected by routes that, on a map, look unnecessarily indirect because the direct route would have passed too close to an installation, or because the indirect route served a military logistics corridor that civilian traffic logic didn't require. The famous gaps in the Appalachians, where interstates seem to avoid the most logical mountain crossings, were partially terrain-driven, but partially driven by the military requirement to route certain corridors through specific passes that could be controlled and defended in a ground conflict. None of this was public. The interstate system's maps, released to the public in the Highway Acts and their amendments, showed routes. They did not show the military rationale behind routing decisions. That information sat in classified planning documents for decades. The system under pressure. What actually happened when it was tested? The Interstate Highway System was never used for nuclear evacuation. That particular catastrophe did not occur. But the system was used for large-scale emergency movement, and those tests revealed both its capabilities and its limitations. In 1979, when 3 Mile Island's nuclear reactor malfunctioned in Pennsylvania, the evacuation of the surrounding region moved along the interstates without the catastrophic gridlock that older road networks would have produced. The design worked. Partially. Traffic moved. Bridges held. Routes connected. But fuel availability collapsed within hours because the interstate system had been designed for movement, not for the logistics of sustaining 2 million vehicles in motion simultaneously. Gas stations along the evacuation corridors ran dry within a day. In 2005, the evacuation of New Orleans ahead of Hurricane Katrina produced a grimmer lesson. Contraflow operations, reversing all lanes of major interstates to outbound traffic, worked, technically. The roads moved vehicles, but the throughput was still insufficient for the scale of the evacuation, and the population without vehicles, disproportionately poor, elderly, and disabled, had no mechanism for using a highway-based evacuation system. The interstate system was built for cars. It was built, implicitly, for a certain demographic of American, the mobile, the car-owning, the able-bodied. Nuclear war planners in the 1950s had known this and essentially decided it was acceptable. The goal of Cold War civil defense planning was not total survival. It was maximum survival of the population that could be moved, which in the automobile-owning middle America of the 1950s was still a very large percentage of the total. The populations without cars, concentrated in urban cores, were closer to the targets anyway. The calculus was brutal, but it was explicit in planning documents that have since been declassified. Eisenhower's ambivalence. Dwight Eisenhower did not see the interstate highway system only as a military asset. He genuinely believed that an interconnected road network would transform American economic life. He was right. The interstate system reshaped where Americans lived, where factories were built, which cities grew and which declined, how freight moved, how long the American commute became. The economic effects of the system were probably larger than any other single piece of peacetime infrastructure in American history. But Eisenhower also watched the system produce consequences he hadn't intended and hadn't wanted. The interstates destroyed urban neighborhoods at a scale that had no precedent in American history. The routing of highways through cities, required by the military need to connect urban centers to the national network, demolished communities in their paths. In city after city, highway planners routed interstates through black neighborhoods, through poor communities, through areas whose residents lacked the political power to resist. The 10 freeway through Los Angeles, the construction of I-94 through Rondo and St. Paul, the Cross Bronx Expressway through working-class neighborhoods in New York. The interstates didn't just pass through cities, they cut them in half. Eisenhower had not intended this. By several accounts, he was disturbed when he understood what urban routing meant in practice. But the system he had authorized, with its emphasis on connecting cities rather than routing around them, created the incentive structure that produced the destruction. The defense requirements for moving military traffic into and out of urban centers meant the highways had to reach into the cities. The path of least financial resistance ran through communities that couldn't fight back. The same system built for survival destroyed the fabric of the neighborhoods it passed through. The legacy hiding in plain sight. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union dissolved. The bomber threat that shaped the highway design standards was replaced first by ICBMs, which gave no warning time at all, making evacuation irrelevant, and then by terrorism, cyber threats, and competition with powers that don't need to bomb American cities to threaten American interests. The nuclear evacuation rationale for the interstate system became a historical footnote. The design standards remained. Every American interstate still meets the load-bearing requirements for heavy military vehicles. The clearances under every overpass still accommodate Army equipment. The access control design still prevents the kind of single-point blockages that would stop military convoys. The minimum lane widths still accommodate tracked vehicles. The system built for a war that never came is the same system you use to drive to work, to move freight across the country, to take your family to a national park. The 48,000 miles of interstate were the largest infrastructure investment any democracy has ever made in preparation for its own potential destruction. And they worked, in a sense, not because nuclear war came and the system evacuated cities, but because the credibility of American defensive preparation may have contributed, alongside other factors, to Soviet decision-makers concluding that a first strike was not a winning strategy. Or perhaps the highways simply made the American economy more efficient, the American labor market more mobile, and American commerce more integrated. And the defense rationale was a useful political cover for something that would have been worth building anyway. What the highway system tells us about how democracies survive. Friedrich Bergius invented synthetic fuel in 1913. Germany built it into an industrial program through the 1920s and 1930s. The technology enabled a war machine that caused incalculable suffering. The parallel is uncomfortable, but instructive. The Interstate Highway System was designed to enable the survival of a civilization. The design standards were drawn from military requirements. The political case was made on civilian economic grounds. The construction displaced and destroyed communities that had no voice in the decision. The system built to save America, in its construction, damaged the America it was meant to save. That tension between the imperatives of national survival and the costs borne by those least able to resist them runs through every major defense infrastructure decision a democracy makes. The nuclear weapons that guaranteed American deterrence required uranium mining on Native American land. The military-industrial complex Eisenhower himself warned about in his farewell address was the same complex he had spent his presidency building. The highway system that connected America was the same system that amputated its cities.